events and misexpected events. So if we talk in terms of misexpected events, what that invites is the idea that we can have an expectation of something. And this is important because in nature, if you're just going about your business and something surprises you, what your brain is basically processing is that you had an expectation that thing wasn't going to happen and then it did, or you had an expectation that something was going to happen and it didn't. Now, the very clear distinction between those two is that when you have an expectation that's not met, we define that as sadness. And a little bit of sadness could be disappointment all the way up to great sadness, which would be called anguish. Now, with surprise, we're talking about not expecting something that does occur. So there's a positive interference into the life. Something is added that was not anticipated. Completely unexpected has nothing to do with creating expectations. So the idea here that Charlesworth determined was that surprise defined as misexpected events, it cannot possibly occur until you're about 6 months old because cognitive development enables us to form those expectations or assumptions. So if you work within this type of framework, there's a good case for assigning an important role to surprise in cognitive development, meaning our ability to think and perceive and determine things. So this relates directly to those of us who may have experiences of constantly being frustrated, constantly being let down by the same thing or same entity or agency over and over again. Let me explain. Some people are really frustrated with large entities like, say, Congress. They seem big and behemothian and overreaching and immovable, right? And yet we're constantly frustrated with the outcomes. They're not doing what we want. They're taxing us too much. They're spending inappropriately. They're doing whatever they're doing, right? And we always have these complaints. Well, what we're failing to account for is our own ability to create those expectations within our own heads. We can do this with spouses, other domestic partners, roommates, bosses, employment terms, really anything where we experience a constant letdown. And the response from me as a clinician is, well, what do you expect? You have this body of history that has determined the characterological traits of whatever it is that you're complaining about, and yet you continue to expect differently. That is incumbent upon you as the person who's always surprised to adjust expectations and align them a little closer to reality so that you're not constantly experiencing that, on your heels, what the heck happened here? When history says exactly what happened is what should have happened. So it's incumbent upon us to align our expectations with Congress. It says, well, historically, since the beginning of Congress, they've always taxed, they've always spent recklessly, they've always bloated, whatever it is that we can historically reasonably see. They're unresponsive to my letters, whatever it is. And then we can align those expectations a little bit better with reality so that we're not at least walking around in constant surprise or disappointment all the time. Now, I want to issue the qualifier that says aligning expectations with reality does not mean that you have to endorse the reality that's going on. It doesn't mean you have to support it or condone it or say that it's okay. It's just that you have to acknowledge it. So for me, in the clinical world, I might be dealing with a teenager who's at odds with his parents, and the parents are just really rigid in their application of rules, and they're inflexible, and they don't understand the kid's dreams and hopes and desires and all that. And maybe this has been going on for a very long time, despite our best efforts to help introduce new information to the parents and help them see a little bit different angle. And my response to the kid would be, well, why are you still surprised at this? And that's a reasonable question to ask because it's up to him to create his own cognitions about what he gets surprised about in that relationship. If the same kid is walking down the forest trail and the forest says, there's a sign at the trail that says, clear path ahead, but then he runs into a rock pile or a big snow drift, he can reasonably say, well, They created an expectation that wasn't fulfilled. I'm surprised at that because I was promised something that wasn't delivered, a clear path, and instead it's covered with rubble or whatever. That's a reasonable expectation to be surprised at. What's not a reasonable expectation is someone's behavior repeatedly across time you go, man, I can't believe they're still doing this. And I was like, well, what do you expect? Like, they've demonstrated to you that they're going to continue doing this. So that's an opportunity for us to bring a little bit of peace into our lives by aligning expectations with reality, while simultaneously saying, I don't like it. It's not something I prefer, and yet I acknowledge that it is actually happening. And if I could birdwalk just a little bit more before the break, it's the difference between acceptable and acceptance. And I know that seems a little vague and possibly hair-splitting, but let me explain. Acceptable has to do with desirability. So if a parent says, that's unacceptable regarding some rules that may be broken by a child in the home, that's fine. It's not acceptable, it's undesirable. But for that same parent to say, I won't accept that he's doing this, that's almost a denial of reality. You have to accept that he's doing it. He just did it. It's like whether or not the kid's throwing food across the room or he dropped his pants and peed on the carpet right in front of you. That's a really colorful image. Sorry for those of you who may be driving and now are laughing at your windshield. The image of a child peeing on the carpet, especially if that child's an older child. Anyway, we have to accept that the peeing on the carpet is happening. It's reality. It's right there in front of us. Doesn't mean that it's acceptable, though. And that's the difference between aligning expectations with reality and condoning the actions that are happening. I don't have to condone the actions of an undesirable Congress, but I do have to accept that it's currently happening. Otherwise, I get continually frustrated because I think somehow I'm going to change it, when what needs to change is my expectations of what's happening based on historical data. So let's take a break. I'll come back after the break and talk about fear and see if I can confuse people even further by using more words that sound exactly the same but have two different definitions. You're listening to the Noggin Notes podcast. This is Fear and Surprise. Okay, hey, we're back after the break, and we're going to dive into fear after exploring the concept of surprise. Now, there's a lot written about fear. There's a lot of different functions of fear, but what we want to focus on right now is the adaptive function of fear. So what does it help you do with regard to the environment? I already told you in the beginning, I gave it away, that the reason we have fear as an emotion is to tell us that there's a threat or a danger present. Typically, these threats and dangers are to physical harm or safety, but they can also be ideological. So if you have a belief system that's being challenged, you can be scared to let go of that and scared to take in new information and integrate different concepts, because what it inevitably means is that you have to leave behind something that's probably served you really well and been comfortable for quite some time. So when we talk about the characteristics of fear, it can present in very different formats, but across cultures, it tends to be the one emotion that people, I'll use the word in the definition, fear the most. When asked what they dread among the different so-called negative emotions, regardless of culture, people reported fear. They don't want to be afraid, and that's pretty understandable, because I think by and large people just want to be secure and they want to know that things are predictable and outcomes will be reasonably guaranteed. So this has all sorts of implications across many avenues. And one in particular is a loss of control. We don't want to lose control over things. And so fear can happen when, say, divorce takes place in the heart of a child. When parents are splitting up, it can create a lot of fear about what the future looks like, whether or not mom and dad will get along, how much time will be spent at one house or the other, and then ultimately just possibility of loneliness and being left alone and having to navigate new pathways. So fear can take the form of very different presentations depending on not only the circumstances and the triggers, but also the person who's experiencing it. And I'll get to that in a minute too, regarding lenses and cognition. So when we look at emotions as causes of fear, we can actually embrace the idea that sometimes we can have like a surprise event or a startle result in a fear response, simply because they're so neurologically similar that they represent a loss of control, right? So if you think back to the beginning when I did the emotions overview, I talked about emotions in the form of a wave, and at the crest of that wave is a loss of control, where you you don't have any choice over whether or not you feel something. So if your habit has been such that you stuff down emotions, avoid them, bail out, cover them up with substances, whatever it is, fear being one of those emotions that you can't, or you already can't tolerate, the very notion of feeling anything, even if it's positive, like happiness or excitement, can result in a fear response, because it means by definition that you have to lose control, at least neurologically speaking, in order to experience it fully. Now, we can dabble in these things and pay lip service to, yeah, I was ashamed. Yeah, I was scared. Yeah, I was guilty. I felt sad. Like you can intellectualize it just a little bit, but that's not really riding the wave. Riding the wave means fully embracing the thing that you felt, maybe expressing some tears, but ultimately you're losing control there for at least just a split second, if not for many seconds at a time, before cognition restores and you pull yourself back together. So think about the stacking effect that would occur if you don't know how to tolerate emotions, or, family, culture, environment has told you that it's inappropriate. So you learn to avoid them, you learn to bail out, you learn to stuff them down, and then a fear response comes. You're already not skilled at tolerating emotions. Now you're asking to tolerate the peak of that emotion that you already can't control, which is the scary part of letting go. And you've got now a fear on top of another emotion, on top of the loss of control. And so it can really result in some anxiety. And fear chiefly is the root of anxiety. Anxiety, loosely speaking, and I've defined this before, I'll do it again, has to do when we fixate our thoughts on something in the future that we can't do anything about because it's not here yet. So again, that loss of control, that loss of predictability, nothing in the future is guaranteed because it hasn't happened yet. It's not here. So we can absolutely have fear about that. And that's typically where anxiety finds its roots, is in fear. Now, contrarily, depression is when we fixate our thoughts on something in the past that has yet to occur. That has already happened, and we can't do anything about it because it's already over. And so we're fixating our thoughts there, and typically that's rooted in sadness. So we're not talking about sadness, we're talking about fear and its relation to anxiety. I'm not going to go into anxiety, that's its own podcast. But for now, just the discrete emotion of fear tells us that there's a threat or a danger, and sometimes that's a threat or a danger to interpretation, belief system, ideology, and that's exactly what happens with anxiety. When you're looking into the future and you can't see it because nobody can predict the future, of course we're going to have a fear response to that. It makes complete sense that we would. So now let's talk about what fear looks like with regard to natural versus learned fear. So natural fear can come from, say, a fear of heights. And I don't want to say that all fears of heights are natural, because some of them are learned as well. If you picture yourself standing on the arm of a couch at 4 years old and mom panics because she doesn't want you to plunge off and crack your skull open, she can teach you to be afraid of being up on top of tall things. However, we do have some evidence through research that shows us that babies who have depth perception, which is right around the 5-month period, can express fear when placed on something that looks like a drop-off, a couple feet maybe on a table. This experiment's totally safe. They're not putting babies next to things that they can fall off of. But what they do is they'll put a plexiglass surface on one side, like an island in the middle, or they'll set the baby, and then on the other side they'll put a shaded area that looks like it's solid. So they'll turn the baby to one side, they'll turn the baby to the other side, and they'll monitor heart rate and so forth, and pupil dilation. And so we know that there are certain fears that are inborn, and one of them might be the fear of heights. However, it can also be taught, as I mentioned before. If mom freaks out every time you climb up on a tall object, you'll learn to be afraid of heights. We've also seen this in monkeys. So there's some experiments done in the early 80s, late 70s, that had to do with taking monkeys reared in the wild who were taught to be afraid of snakes. Monkeys reared in a laboratory environment, basically in a controlled, non-threatening environment, had no such reaction to when introduced to a snake or a snake-like object. So there are certain learned fears that stick with us for a really long time, and then we end up handing those down oftentimes to our next generations. We've seen this through survivors of say, genocide, post